Welcome to the Mac Power Users. My name is David Sparks. I'm joined by my friend and yours, Stephen Hackett. How are you doing, Stephen?
I'm good, David. How are you today?
I am having a wonderful September. I heard from a couple listeners that are giving money to St. Jude. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but I love that. And one of my favorite people on the internet is guesting today. Welcome to the show, Matt Cassinelli.
Wow, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, Matt, you and I met on the dance floor. I don't know if you remember that.
Well, hang on.
What? I think you were there too, Stephen.
Was I?
Yeah.
At the James Dempsey.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
back in the day. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, this guy came up to me. He gave me some workflow stickers. We started talking, and it's like, you know how like when a fellow introverted nerds meet and they like have something in common and they just like match. That was me and Matt.
I wore my workflow shirt because I knew I was like, I have to just like break the ice. Otherwise I'll just stand there and want to say hi.
Yeah. Well, either way, Matt and I feel like we're pals and we are fellow nerds, fellow travelers. So we have a lot to share today with the Mac Power's listeners. But before we do so, Stephen, it's September.
It is September, and September is Childhood Cancer Awareness Month. Each year, those of us at Relay take some time to talk about St. Jude. St. Jude Children's Research Hospital is in my backyard here in Memphis, Tennessee, but its mission and its reach truly is global. I first showed up at St. Jude in 2009 when our oldest son was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and we became a St. Jude family. He underwent chemo and surgery and all this stuff at St. Jude over the course of a couple of years. And now he is a survivor. He is getting ready to be 16 and doing really well. And through that journey, we've learned a lot about St. Jude's focus on survivorship. So one thing they do is the St. Jude Life Study. And our son, Josiah, is a part of this. It's a long-term follow-up study where St. Jude patients are brought back to the hospital every 5 years for an assessment. And this is important because things like chemo and radiation, like they're serious things. And the life study helps researchers learn about the long-term effects on childhood cancer survivors so they can reduce treatment-related health conditions down the road. The St. Jude Life Study has one of the only data sets in the world with the ability to comprehensively represent racial and ethnic groups that are often left out of childhood cancer survivorship. And that's because St. Jude's mission is global. They treat families and their children from around the world without regard for their ability to pay. And so that makes St. Jude really special. And not only just to my family, but thousands of other patient families who travel to St. Jude, or even families that never make it to St. Jude, but St. Jude's research and treatment being shared around the world impacts their care wherever they may be. It's really cool. And we've been raising money as a community for 6 years now, since 2019. And we have raised over $3 million for St. Jude. And that's a real testament to this community. It's an extremely humbling number when we hit that. We hit it just as we began the campaign this year. Really incredible. But we're doing this all month. And we're doing something really cool this year. We did this last year as well, where you can actually go to stjude.org/relay and sign up to host your own fundraiser. And when you do that, you not only get to earn some limited edition incentives yourself, but you can set up incentives for your campaign. So if you're doing something unique in your community, you can do that and spread the word of St. Jude. And this is a great way to get this campaign in front of people. Believe it or not, there are some people who don't listen to Mac Power Users. There's a few of them out there. And having your own campaign with us is a great way to get the mission of St. Jude in front of them. So go to stjude.org/relay. You can register to create your own fundraiser. All the details are there. And it's really awesome. And of course, you can straight up donate. You can do donor advised fund giving if you're going to make a large gift, which is awesome. You can also do employee matching. A lot of companies will match their employees' donations. So all that information is over there at stjude.org/relay. So please join us in supporting St. Jude this September. Again, stjude.org/relay.
I got this great email this morning from listener Michael in the UK, who was listening to last week's episode in the car with his lovely wife, and they heard us talk about St. Jude. And during the trip, they decided to make a sizable donation. He wrote in and sent me a note. And he said it made him look nice with his wife, too. So if you want to look good for your lady, give some money to St. Jude. That's all I'm saying.
Absolutely. It's good. I like that. It's no, it's really such a universal mission, right? No, I mean one of the very famous sayings around St. Jude, it comes from Daniel Thomas, is that no child should die in the dawn of life. I can't imagine many other things in the world that we can all agree on.
Yeah. All right, gang, give it to St. Jude, stjude.org/relay. Matthew, so I teased at the beginning how we had met in the early days, but tell us a little bit about yourself and how you find yourself as one of the shortcuts gurus of the internet.
Well, it's all thanks to Mac Power users.
Are you serious?
And for real, I lived in San Francisco and was working in the city, as it's called when you live in the East Bay. And so I would commute underground on BART every day into the city. And I quickly realized that I couldn't read stuff or listen to stuff also. So I would use Instapaper and then the podcast apps like Overcast to listen to Mac Power users. And so it totally got me into this world for real. So I will just say thank you. I owe it all to you.
I had no idea. That's awesome.
Yeah. And then basically, I feel like probably at some point you mentioned Mac Stories. And then I mean, of course, I listened to all the great shows and Relay since the beginning as well. So also, it's like just awesome that NPU is now part of Relay and has been for a while. But I don't know, I'm just fangirling right now. But then, yeah, definitely, I'm sure at some point one of you guys mentioned, or I just heard Federico talking and then started to learn about this app called Workflow. And at the time I was doing marketing, and I think it's to some degree, I don't know, and maybe it's not like a failure, but I didn't fully accomplish what I wanted to go there and translate what is an otherwise fairly confusing tool to basically regular people, because I slowly realized that I was becoming a power user with this tool. And as everyone's saying, like, become a developer or a programmer, while not even knowing that I was doing it, I worked at Workflow and was sitting next to them, and they were like, yeah, that's just what you do as a programmer. And I was like, oh, cool. I already know how to do this now. So the app definitely just really introduced me to, I feel like, what I got from the App Store of like, oh, these people can create these apps that I can use. Workflow brought that to me where I could make my own while also not having to like fully develop a business model just to make a grocery shortcut or something like that.
Sure.
So I sort of saw that balance of getting more out of my technology while like not necessarily devoting my life to one domain of that technology. I mean, of course, now I'm the shortcuts guy, and it seems like one specific domain when in reality it touches pretty much any domain you want, depending how clever you want to be as well, because I've made plenty of shortcuts that are basically just URLs for websites, but in the end I've created a whole workflow around a website that otherwise doesn't support it.
And for listeners who don't know, so Workflow was the app that Apple purchased and eventually became Shortcuts, but it was started by a really small team. There was Ari and a couple other people. I don't know if they want us to say who they were on a podcast, but it was a small team, and so Matt went over to kind of help. I guess you were doing communications. You were sharing how to make workflows, that they needed somebody, and I guess you were doing customer support, I would guess, as well at the time.
We had a customer support person at the time, but I did take that over when we went to Apple.
Yeah.
But at Workflow, I basically, the very first project was not redesigning, but doing the copywriting on the website.
Yeah.
And that was such a mind stretch because it was like, what is a workflow? Like, what actually is this thing? And so I spent like all this time banging my head against the wall and then I ended up just doing some it's like get things done faster. I don't know. It was very, very basic in the end. But then I ended up taking over the gallery. And so that is very much why I'm still doing what I do today, because I trained myself to find a topic and then make essentially like a set of example shortcuts for that subject so that other people could just go at Workflow. You could just go into the gallery and get workflows to install. But now with shortcuts, I make my own, and it's just like oh, there's Arc Search. They have shortcut support, so I'll make a bunch of example ones for people that they can download.
Yeah.
Just because it's kind of like, I do this in my sleep. Like if somebody says something to me, I can like build the workflow in my brain. And it's very much true that the last few years, shortcuts is slower than I can go. And that's been the biggest issue because there's just a lot of bugs in it when you get to a scale of a couple thousand shortcuts, which is a little much.
Yeah, we're going to definitely talk about that. But I mean, I feel like, an interesting bit of this, and if you listen to the Automators podcast I do with Rose, this is kind of old hat, but Apple really didn't embrace automation on iPhone and iPad when they first released it, whereas on Mac, we have this thing called Apple Events, which allows you to make things like Apple Script and so many different automations. There wasn't really a simple backdoor into automation, and that was a security thing that they wanted to do from the beginning. So Apple had, really not done a good job of making shortcuts or automation support. And then the workflow team's genius was figuring out every little hack, URL schemes, whatever. And this was an app that came out and it was in beta for like, I don't remember. It was like 6 months or it was longer maybe, because I feel like Apple couldn't figure out whether they were going to let it through or not. And then it kind of changed everything, before, you worked with them for a bunch of time, and then Apple bought Workflow, and we all worried, that, that's the end of it. They're going to take that team and put them on, working on modem software or something, but that's not what happened.
Do you want to know some inside baseball about what some of that external story?
Yeah, totally.
Because I took over support, that was basically my role at Apple. I only stayed for about 9 months because I was like, you guys all inspired me to do the indie dream. And then suddenly I worked at the largest corporation in the world. And it was,
Sorry about that.
All these levels of permissions and stuff. But there's many other reasons. But basically, I was the person who sent that email to Casey that said, there's like technically no plans for like workflow as it is. And I did not enjoy having to use that language. And after that email where it basically spread that it like sounded like Apple wasn't going to support it anymore.
Yeah.
I got that language out of our email, just kind of made that decision of like, we should stop emphasizing this. And I didn't know at the time any other future plans, but I think it made it sound like workflow was dead in the water when the thing that I most respected about the acquisition was that they saw that there was this existing community and they supported it. And they made sure to, even up to this day, there's actions in there that are from workflow just because people might still be using those, which is cool. And that was, I think, one of the reasons it's had legs in a different way beyond just something like Siri shortcuts and a separate feature that they kind of slowly integrated over time. So I think that's been a fantastic part of the whole process, is that there has been a level of continuity all the way up through now. And even just URL schemes and the team that, or the work that the team did to make all of these functions that were actually third-party APIs. Like every developer technically could have, or like anybody technically could have made workflow beyond maybe the URL scheme part. But I think that was why it was to some degree so valuable to Apple, because the team were just so good at iOS, like sitting next to them and hearing them just like pull APIs and references out of their brain and like unpack the levels of knowledge was just mind-blowing. And so I was very glad to see them get the opportunity to work at Apple and do this stuff internally, because that's like taking off the shackles and I don't know the metaphor, but going inside and getting to like peek behind the curtain, I think we've seen the benefits of that.
Yeah. And it was, I felt like I loved it, but I always felt like a little hacky and on the edge of not working, because it was these URL schemes that, might or might not work in a few years. But then once it went inside Apple, they started like making it native to the operating system, and workflow got even better. It's one of those acquisitions that can be celebrated, because by being on the inside, they were able to make it better. And then, kind of then like you were there for, like you said, for 9 months, but I mean, you look, it's been years now that Shortcuts has been part of the operating system on mobile, and even a few years now on Mac. And Apple seems like they're really serious about it. I mean, I've had some interaction with the Shortcuts team over the years, and it's a nice size. It's a group of people that are completely dedicated to automation and always trying to make it better, and that's good.
I think especially with App Intense and what's coming with Apple Intelligence, I think that's going to be even more prevalent, because
Yeah,
I think App Intense is the API that going to power a good portion of Apple Intelligence. And we can get into more details later, but I think that sort of transitioned in around like 2021, I think it was. And to me, I sort of missed it because I was slightly distracted by other things going on in the world. But it was a really big sea change, I think, to make these APIs powerful and flexible in a way that now everything in Shortcuts is powered by it, and going forward, everything that developers add will be using the same APIs. So some of the problems that we've had from even back in the workflow days of just adoption and like you were saying, URL schemes that might break, there's basically now a very, very good reason for every app developer to adopt this. And Apple's saying you should. So I think it's going to be an exciting time. See, coming back to the Mac especially, because I think that is one of the areas that's had some of the least investment in terms of developers.
And Apple Intelligence will be looking at those app intents for its magic, and we're actually going to talk about Apple Intelligence and automation at length in the More Power Users session at the end of today's show. But just that point that they're using the same underlying architecture for Shortcuts and Apple Intelligence means that whether you're chasing Shortcuts or Apple Intelligence, the other one benefits because it's going to work in both places.
Totally.
This episode of the Mac Power Users is brought to you by 1Password. Go to onepassword.com/MPU for 20% off your plan. 1Password is the password manager that has so much more. With 1Password, you get security and productivity wrapped into one. With 1Password, you can secure everything. Store all your sign-ins in secure vaults with the ability to secretly share passwords, secrets, and more. It's so easy to share, gang. I do it all the time with friends who are not even 1Password subscribers. And you can also manage access to every application and web account and every member of your account. So whether you've got a family or a company or even an individual account, you've got complete control there. And you can do it from any device. You can sign in to everything from any device and manage permissions to ensure only healthy devices are allowed to access. 150,000 businesses trust 1Password, and that's for a reason. These people are obsessive about your security. I've been friends with some of the folks over 1Password since they were a small 1-2-person company, and they've grown with this ethic since then to always be the best security application possible for users, no matter what their needs are. And it really does range from enterprise to individuals. You can secure your business, protect your people, or bring it home and protect the whole family. We use a 1Password for Families account, and it's been really great over the years because my kids have figured out the importance of passwords as we've been using shared passwords, and they've got this great password software on their devices. They tell me they're the only ones that do that in their age, and I think that's cool that they are protecting themselves. So protect your passwords with a secure password manager. 1Password.com/MPU is that link one more time. Check it out, and thank you, 1Password, for all of your support of the Mac Power Users. We're going to talk more about automation, but I thought we should just stop. I call it the bona fides. Tell us what kind of Apple gear you're using and what you like about it.
Oh, yeah, sweet. Where should I start? I guess I should start with the Mac. I bought into the M1 cycle, and I haven't cycled out of it yet, and I'm probably going to this year. But I have a M1 Mac Mini and then a MacBook Air because I invested deeper into the Mac Mini instead of the laptop ecosystem, partially because I was working at home, and then also knowing that stuff like iPad I could use more. I didn't necessarily need as much strength on the laptop. And now I'm at the point where I'm hitting those edges, but the Mac Mini has been my powerhouse for sure, and I run all of my streaming stuff through there, all my video production, and I have 2 LG monitors instead of Apple ones, partially because this is also a gaming setup, so I switched the main monitor to the Xbox, and then I use a second monitor for the stream and stuff like that. And I really could not figure out another way to do this without using basically bad monitors. They're 4K, but they're not good resolution on the Mac. So I think that's probably like the worst part of my setup.
I want to just take a minute on that. Okay,
Sure.
So first of all, the Mac Mini, I think that is the unsung hero of the Mac Power Users audience, because I hear from so many listeners that have settled on that as their desktop machine, and I don't think we give it enough credit on the show. I mean, I bought the fancy Mac Studio. Do I really need it? I don't know. A souped up Mac Mini probably would have been good enough,
Yeah.
What about a new tiny Mac Mini?
Yeah, I'm probably leaning towards the Mac Studio because I have 10 Stream Decks plugged in and stuff like that I need the ports. Or I've been daisy chaining everything, but I think I've noticed that I can't stream at 60 frames per second on my Mac Mini. It drops frames, and so I'm just leaning up towards that. Otherwise, though, I definitely think the Mac Mini is killer. Yeah, it's for most people. I mean, I don't know. It just depends on your needs, of course. But outside of production stuff, I wouldn't need anything more than this.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a great computer. I do think that for a lot of folks out there, don't be ashamed to buy a Mac Mini and save yourself a few bucks, because I think for most work, it is plenty Mac.
Yeah,
I think especially the M1, I was like, oh, okay, this is the time to invest in this.
Yeah. But you also do a lot of work with shortcuts on mobile. Actually, let me wind back there. So the screen thing is so are you using like gaming consoles or a PC rig?
Yeah, just an Xbox Series X.
Yeah, okay.
And then I have a Elgato 4KX is their latest recording tool. That is, I'll just say up front, I'm an Elgato partner because I could tell that they have all this amazing Mac gear and they never really talk to like an Apple audience. So that's part of why I was like, hey, I want to like connect you guys to this audience. And then also totally because now I have like 5 Stream Decks that they give you all the gear and stuff like that. So basically just so you can test it. And so that I use that for recording gameplay. And then I have the mics, and the mic arms are actually very nice. I'll say the low profile and the big one are very heavy duty.
Yeah. I'm using the low profile one right now. I think David and I both have switched to it.
Yeah, and I have all the Stream Decks, but they didn't send them to me. I sent them a lot of money. So yeah, I get it. Yeah.
Yeah. So Matt, you have this post on Threads. It's a little old now, from May, that has a picture of your setup. We'll include that in the show notes, and people just go look at this. I mean, because there are a lot of different ways to do the dual display thing. And I think yours is really interesting because you've kind of mixed, your production work for your blog and site and everything with, kind of a more traditional workspace. And I think it's really interesting. But an iPad is front and center there, right? You've got your Mac Mini. We spoke about that. But where does the iPad fit in day to day? And how does that interact with this setup that is also kind of built for Mac OS?
Sure. Part of what I did with my entire desk setup is that it is modular and switches between multiple different setups. So the one that's in Threads has 2 side-by-side monitors, and then I have the Elgato teleprompter in the middle, which is actually that's also fantastic. It's very good it's basically a USB monitor, and so it enables you to have your entire Mac desktop over on the prompter while filming through it and looking directly at the center of the screen. So I don't actually use the teleprompter mode just because I prefer not to read and look back and forth while I'm recording, because I feel like it's very obvious in people's eyes. You can see it all the time in the WWDC videos and the developer videos. But it's just a very helpful tool to like put your script up and be looking directly at the camera. But basically, the iPad fits in that setup as a way to have my script while the 2 screens. I'm actually not even using the Mac in that. Oh no, I actually am on the left. Okay. So depends on what I do, but the monitors can also have the HDMI inputs directly from I have two Lumix GH5s as my recording cameras for video. And so I can basically switch the monitors from either my Mac to a camera or to my gaming setup all from the same space. And then sometimes I'll even like turn one monitor vertically and things like that. So I try to have it all like perfect and laid out. But I think a running theme that happens throughout my work is that I just overdo it. And so I'm like, I have 10 separate setups. And to like even just remember what those are, I have to like basically make a whole video just to get through the entire thing and then finalize it in my brain. So sometimes it's a long and slow process. And I think it's hard as a productivity person to not want to get it perfect before I share it.
Sure.
When in reality, it's never going to be perfect and it'll always change. That was a long-winded way of talking about how the iPad also fits in. And like right now I have it off to the right and I use it with like Sidecar and things, or universal control to basically just like use that, like put on a YouTube video or Twitch. I actually do watch videos all the time while I work because I feel like it unlocks something in my brain when I don't want to work that I'm just like, okay, no, I'll do it. So the iPad fits in all different types of places. Also separately, I just use the iPad outside of this desk setup because I think if you do look at that photo, it's a lot. And it's what you can only see in the top left is the 42-inch softbox. And then also what's not pictured is the backdrop bars overhead that have the camera on top pointing down so that I can film what I'm doing. But I'm basically sitting in a production setup at all times. And that's not a productive environment for focus for like a single task type of thing. And so that's why something like an iPad Pro fits very perfectly into my life, is because I can do almost all of the same tasks. I've spent a very long time trying to figure out the apps that work cross-platform. And so now it's mostly like, what am I doing? Like the Phil Schiller philosophy of like, pick the right device for the stage that you're at. It's like, I'll start on the phone and then use the iPad to write the script and then put it in front of the Mac and then do the full production thing from there. So it's very varied.
Yeah, and I think really a good point is that the iPad always can be a secondary monitor to a Mac, even if you don't have multiple screens. Like I only have one monitor, but it's big. But I still have uses for like putting stuff off to the side. Like when I record, it's the same thing. I have my outlines and whatnot on the iPad, and then that way it's not on the screen that I'm recording. And I could see this in any kind of application, even if you're like, fancy business guy, maybe you're on a Zoom call and you keep your notes on the iPad underneath or something.
Well, that was something that was big about the iPad that this summer that I moved back to Portland this last year. And I've started to feel very self-conscious about working in coffee shops with like an excessive setup with a laptop and an iPad. Yeah. And then I slowly realized that like a lot of people do it. Like there's a lot of people who have those $200 external monitors that you can, and they'll put like spreadsheets up. And I would see this at WeWork all the time. And so I started to get a little more brave outside of my own home. And so that the stand I use for that iPad in that Threads photo is actually a really, really good adjustable stand. And the height that I have it at, you can actually fit a laptop in front of it. And so I got this stand from someone who was at a coffee shop, and I went over and asked him what kind it was. And so now I use that. The only one thing is putting a expensive iPad Pro up on a stand is kind of freaky. There's just a certain amount of kinetic energy that it has that is like, yeah. I'm like, oh no, like I did drop it once and it dented the stand at least and not the iPad. But
yeah, you're just like, please stay put where you are.
I used to have an iMac at my desk, which is a standing desk as well, and I had like anxiety dreams about the iMac falling off and breaking. So like that was why I went towards the Mac Mini.
The Mac Mini, yeah, it's nice and stationary there. So you've got all this gear, and you're doing writing, you're doing video work. When you move between these different outputs in your content business, like was the goal with this setup, hey, I can move fluidly between these things, or because it's all kind of in one setup, are you having to really like shift modes when it's time to go from, writing a blog post or, building shortcuts to share to streaming or something else?
I definitely have to shift modes, and I think that's one of the least streamlined parts, while also having a bunch of automation around it. I think the same thing is that I end up like reinventing the wheel constantly, and I think that's something I think it's maybe like I'm going through the process of getting diagnosed for ADHD, which maybe you can tell from the way I record my shows, but I think it's something like that. Like I even wrote down like my podcast setup checklist today, and I've done 200 podcast setups before, and for some reason I feel inclined to always redo it. I think because of this, because it does always change, and like I just got new mics and haven't tested them out, so I think that's something that there is always a shift around it. But having it all in one, I think, was really important to me because I just didn't see any other way to do it, and especially with shortcuts, I think I found a lot of ways to make at just enough of the pain points less painful that I can do more of this work without forgetting all of the details. Because I think there's something that if I didn't use shortcuts, there's definitely no way I would have been able to do the stuff that I've done the last 7 years since going independent, because it does save me from doing that like reprocessing over and over again way more than actually just doing it every single time. Like those shortcuts are I essentially create a shortcut for each step of the flow so that I can just step through my shortcuts folder and get to the end. But it's essentially sometimes I think about I think it was I never say his name out loud. Gray,
yeah, CGP
talked about I knew I was going to get it wrong. That's why I hesitated. But he talks about like the work isn't the work; it's like designing the work is the work. I don't know. That was a terrible quote, but essentially, like the structure around your work is oftentimes what it takes to be able to do that production work over and over again. And so I do have a ton of things like for link posts and stuff like that. That especially blogging is killer with shortcuts because there's so much HTML and or data that you can pull from websites that I wouldn't want to go grab manually. Like all of that stuff, all of my link posts I would never have done. And that's been like a major chunk of my newsletter, at least, just to like share what other people are doing with shortcuts. Because I think what's been true for me for a long time is what other people do with it, and other people's workflows are so much more interesting than the ones that I've already solved. And the ones that I have already solved are just like normal to me and very specific to my setup. So sometimes it just doesn't make sense for other people.
I think there's definitely something to this idea of working on the setup versus doing the work. But I also think that you have to be careful. I mean, I hear from people all the time because I talk a lot about setups and contextual computing and get things set up right. But at some point, you have to do the work, and you don't.
Also, I have over-indexed in that area. My setup is better than the amount of videos I've made with it, and I think that was to a degree something basically related to COVID. And right when I was kind of hitting a certain stride with it, it was a time when I no longer wanted to make videos, but. So I've used it for a lot of podcasts and streams and things like that. But I think the video production thing is something that I want to get a lot more out of. And especially with automation, like the deep end of video production requires a lot of nitty gritty work. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for automation. It just really requires it to be something that you're doing every day for it to be useful.
Yeah, and what he's talking about there is at mattcassinelli.com, he does a ton of videos on shortcuts and how to make them and other automation-related topics. You also have a membership program. I'm a member, by the way. I love what you do, and I'm happy to support you.
Appreciate it.
And it's just a kind of great little watering hole for news on shortcuts automation. And because I guess I didn't really finish it earlier, you after working for Workflow, then working for Apple, then when you went out on your own and struck out, you made this great website, which is just a really good resource for people who want to get better at automation. particularly via shortcuts.
Oh yeah, it's like 98% shortcuts. I've been spreading more out into gear and just apps and workflows related to stuff and usually I'll find a way to tie it back to shortcuts, but that's just been my beat since I was at the WWDC. I feel like it was Alt conference and they announced, I hadn't even heard the word shortcuts by the time I left. And so I was like, oh, this is going to be the same app, but just Apple version and better over time. So I figured I might as well share what I know and make my shortcuts. And I try to give away a good amount just because that's sort of the spirit of the open internet. But then also the membership thing is more of just the fancy ones that I like put a lot of effort into for very specific things sometimes that it's kind of just like, this is the stuff that I love and do for fun anyways. And so I might as well share it.
In addition, now you have invoked the word Stream Deck. So you have to tell me a little bit, what are you doing with all those Stream Decks?
I mean, a lot. It's mostly shortcuts, of course, but part of it is taking all of those shortcuts that I've created and creating separate profiles and keys for each of the shortcuts. It's another example of something that I've automated with shortcuts and wouldn't otherwise do, because part of it is that you can just get the icon out of the shortcut. And so for Stream Deck, it's already not super easy to make nice looking icons. And then just by taking what are essentially mostly SF symbols and then a palette of 15 Apple designer picked colors, you can make all these buttons for the Stream Deck that just look really nice. That's just one separate function. But then just using I think it's called OSA Apple Script is a plugin for the Stream Deck that can run Apple scripts. And I essentially, this is the sloppiest part, is that it's hard coded using the title of the shortcut. And Apple has, in I think the last year or two, added the ability to refer to shortcuts by an ID universally. And this is a good example of like, I know that and I shared it, but to fully integrate that across my whole system would take me like 3 weeks of work just because I have so much.
Yeah.
But I think that's another way that I'm trying to make, because essentially I always have this meta issue of I'm making shortcuts, but I'm also making them to share with other people. And so to make them shareable, I can't there's a shortcuts plugin for the Stream Deck, but it requires your shortcuts and your like values essentially. So I essentially use a third-party plugin that refers to it hard-coded so that I can share all of my Stream Deck profiles for all of my different apps. And then I basically just, because I asked Elgato to get the Stream Deck XL, the huge one, and then the Stream Deck Plus has the dials on it. I already had the Stream Deck Mini because that's just a nice little, while you're streaming, it's helpful to be able to just like grab it and mute it. While I have the other main Stream Deck showing me like the different functions that I would want to use while I'm streaming. There was a good series of articles from Jason Snell and Dan Morin about podcast chapter markers, and that was one of my favorite uses for Stream Deck still. It's just while you're recording something like this, like anytime you go to an ad read, you just press a button and it puts in an edit marker or a chapter marker for your editor so that they can, for me, it was when I'm producing a live stream by myself, I can't go back afterwards and add in 2 hours of chapter markers, or I can, but it just takes so much time. And so if I can essentially capture chapters live while I'm recording at the end, it takes me a quarter of the time to do the post-production. So like there's a lot of little benefits there. Stream Deck though is, part of it for me is just fun. Like the dials on the Stream Deck Plus, you can program left and right to be any sort of key combinations. So you can do like arrow keys and things like that. And then you can use these dials to scroll through cells in Airtable or something like that. There's a lot of fun there. I love they have a bunch of different other plugins too that just show me the CPU usage while I'm streaming so that I can see, oh, I'm like overloading. That's how I know that my Mac Mini can't really handle it, is because usually it's just getting completely overloaded. But But there's just a lot of the like Stream Deck can show a different profile depending on what app you're using. So in many ways, it's creating the experience that I wish I had on iPhone and iPad of anytime I use an app, the shortcuts for that app are just available. And that's something that I wish was easier even with like the action button on the iPhone is just like when I'm in an app, how do I call up all the shortcuts that I've created for that app? On the iPad, I use home screen widgets. On the Mac, there's only actually I did try to use multiple desktops, but the widgets only exist across desktops and not per desktop. And I totally would do that. Like I would turn my Mac into a giant iPad with 16 home screens and different widgets across it if I could. It mostly just isn't designed for it. And I will also say, when you turn off one monitor and then turn on the other and turn it vertically, that ruins your widget setup. So I actually don't use the shortcuts widget on the Mac because I can't, because it constantly moves it off of my desktop and back into Notification Center. And that's just like, nope, too bad. Just specific to my setup, I can't. So that's why I invested deeply in the Stream Decks. I mean, I didn't. I just went for it is mostly what it is because I could. Although I will say the pedal is killer, the foot pedal, because you can do a lot of controls while you're like even I'll do a next tab in Safari. Left and right is just a very simple one, but that one's really great when you're just sitting there.
This episode of Mac Power Users is brought to you by NetSuite. What does the future hold for business? Ask 9 experts and you'll get 10 answers. Some say rates will rise or fall. Others may say inflation is up or down. The only way business owners can know for sure is if someone invents a crystal ball. Well, until then, over 38,000 businesses have future-proofed their business with NetSuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time insights and forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. When you're closing the books in days and not weeks, you're spending less time looking backward and more time looking at what's next. Having a single source of truth of information in your business is huge. When you have things spread across multiple systems, multiple documents, things get messy and error-prone. So essentially, NetSuite is a great opportunity to future-proof your business and get clarity by having that single source of truth. Speaking of opportunity, download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/MPU. That's NetSuite, NETSUITE. netsuite.com/MPU. Go check out that free guide. Our thanks to NetSuite for the support of the show and all of Relay.
Okay, so Matt, you have been with Shortcuts before it was Shortcuts, right? You've been really involved with it, workflow Shortcuts at Apple, and now it's your day job too with mattcassinelli.com. I thought it'd be fun to just talk to you about Shortcuts in general in 2024. How's it doing? Where can they improve? But let's break it down between the Mac and mobile versions. How is the mobile version of Shortcuts doing these days?
I think it depends who you ask. And I'm curious what you guys think as well, because it's always in a certain amount of rough shape due to bugs, which I think is just sort of an existential problem with it. And sort of the prioritization of something like app shortcuts over something like the shortcuts editor experience. I think especially for people like me who have many, many shortcuts, the apps are just slow and they can't handle the amount of data that's in there. And so things like sync just like slow it down every time you open it. I'll open a shortcut and because I'm loading 400 different apps, it'll take a second to load and things like that. So there's a lot of death by 1,000 cuts there. I think otherwise though, like functionally with Apple Intelligence coming, I think it's going to be better than it ever has been, because in theory, every app that does adopt it will have many more shortcuts functions because their recommendations have changed from like just do the most important things to everything your app does should be an app intent. Like that was a big slide that they put up. And so whether or not developers execute that the way that I see it is remains to be seen. Like I think it's just a lot by nature, developers will always have the issue of they know their domain really well, and I've like seen everything across shortcuts. So like I do developer consulting now for that exact reason of like I can just help you immediately. Like I know, and I can just think of 15 apps off the top of my head, kind of thing. So I think for iOS, that world is going to be a lot better, just in terms of there's going to be so many more functions that you can take advantage of. I think Apple's, in general, across both platforms, Apple's own apps are always slightly lagging behind in a weird way. Slightly, I think it is due to the nature of like, they have to build the APIs first, and then their own teams take them after they're done and build with them. They can't like pre-build while they're still not finished. I think that's the like existential nature of Apple as well, is that that's just kind of always how it's going to be. At least that's how it's played out as well. But the iPhone also has a lot more in terms of automation and just in terms of unique functions that take advantage of mobile, like your current location, things like that, that don't really make sense on the Mac, or they kind of do, but just even don't execute the same way. Like it's just slow, for example.
Yeah.
So I think that, and just like I think by the nature of home screens and just the way people use their phones, there's a lot more opportunity for like casual shortcuts usage and ways to like find ways that it can fit into your life. Whereas something like the Mac is going to be a lot more specialized, but also can be even more powerful because for most people, that's probably where you're doing the most amount of work. But I think, again, something like creating 15 shortcuts for one app doesn't make as much sense on the Mac versus like an iPad where I can fill out a widget, for example. So I think the Mac is sort of, I mean, they announced it as the future of automation on the Mac, and then they haven't talked about it since then. And so, but technically that still applies.
Yeah, I mean, the Mac's a whole thing, which we'll get to, I'm sure. But what about the sort of the experience? You mentioned earlier that Apple has this idea and this vision that and maybe some people do it. It sounds like you do it way more than I do. Like I'm on my phone, and then I'm going to get my Mac, and then I'm going to float over to my iPad for some other situation, some other project, or I'm in a different environment and the tablet makes more sense. Shortcuts is across all of those things, right? And it's supposed to sync, and sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't, to your point about the bugginess. But how do you think Shortcuts is doing as a cross-platform tool? Like, kind of zoomed out from, there's like things I should do on the home screen of the phone. But when we're talking about, okay, I'm in the Apple ecosystem, I want my shortcuts to be with me wherever I am. How do you think they're doing on that front?
I think at least for me, that's been one of the biggest benefits, is that everything I did for years on iPad was just already available on Mac. And so I could just move forward from there and not even really have to adopt anything new. I think for most users, though, they didn't come from that world. And I think there's a trick of like, you can program shortcuts to work cross-platform, or you can choose to create them separately. I prefer to make them cross-platform. I think that's one of the biggest benefits, is that it's in most ways a similar interface across all of platforms. And so even when I am using my iPad, the downsides of the physical tool I'm using are almost like negated because I'm just using this interface already. So I think that's why it makes the iPad better, is because I'm not touching all over the screen and reaching up. Like, especially when it first came out, that was all we had for if you weren't a developer. And so, I mean, even before the cursor, oh my God, I still have basically RSI from making the gallery on the iPad screen. But just the ability to bring them across and use them on the phone too, I think that's still one of the biggest benefits of shortcuts that for me is almost like the hardest to communicate, because I was like born into that world already, versus starting out and like realizing, oh man, I can use this across all these platforms, is often like where you get the most just like progress through something like shortcuts. I mean, even using them on the AirPods and HomePod, I feel like that's one of those things that I feel like I'm the only person in the world who knows that you can do that. And has been available for like 5 years now. And so like I was making API requests from my AirPods 5 years ago, and like people don't know. I mean, you just have to even know what that means, first of all, for that to be useful. But the amount of power that's been here in shortcuts is like mostly similar to what was in workflow. Beyond, they've added a lot to it as well, of course, but I think a lot of the value that you can get there has been around for a long time. I think that speaks to even like I left Apple and didn't do some of the marketing that I wish we could have, of just explaining what's available in the app. And I think it's sort of been implied that it's good enough for power users and then regular people don't use it. And I don't think that's true anymore. I think there's 10 million teens out there who have home screens designed with shortcuts. And I think most people have tried it and stopped using it because it was still too confusing. And I think that's something that still needs to be worked on a lot. And we've actually seen it seems minor, but I think a huge deal that I specifically asked for too was just rearranging the actions in the app so that you can see which scripting actions are more relevant than other ones. And it's always just been alphabetical, just because that's engineering essentially. And now when you go into shortcuts in iOS 18, like the variable actions are near the top of the scripting category, and the device actions that were in scripting are now in their own category. Control center stuff, all the controls have their own category. So there's just a lot more. When you first use this app and go in, you can get a lot more out of it. And I think that goes all the way back to the Mac, of just like most people, if you are a developer, you'll probably just go beyond shortcuts already. And if you're someone who listens to Mac power users, you'll probably use it, but then kind of get lost somewhere along the way. And then shortcuts kind of doesn't work out for people. So I think they need to do a lot more with making both the iOS and the Mac app accessible, and going beyond with, especially in the Mac, there's so much more opportunity of things like Swift Playground, step through each step to see what's happening and like let users understand what's going on in between each step. I think would be very powerful. Sorry, I got again distracted on the Mac.
No.
I'd like to go back though and pick up on a couple of those points, because I would argue for user like instruction, they have a ways to go for basic users, and but I would argue that the app itself is much more geared towards the basic users that make like 2 to 5 action scripts, and and then the power users like us who have 1,000 shortcuts and have shortcuts with 30 actions or 100 actions in them. We're the weirdos, and I think it's really ill-suited for that in a lot of ways. It's just kind of my feeling. I feel like they're not really looking to help the power users, even though I think they need to do more.
I can't totally speak to like what they actually think, but like my vibe is always just that, like almost that the power users are happy, which I think is like probably the least true. I think all of us are. There's so many people who would be power users who have given up, and I think like I almost like can't give up. And then just because it's Apple, I feel like it doesn't make sense. Like it's going to get better, and I think there's always we're stuck in that realm of it's a third-party tool from acquisition. So like there's by nature, it started with this technical debt, and it's always hard to come out of it. I think too, but like you're saying, shortcuts developers essentially have no tooling and no app store. And so on top of all of those things, it's just you're pretty much doing it all on your own. And so at least in terms of like a platform, there's a lot more that they can improve. I think at least for a company that serves their shareholders, I think making money is one of the important things. And I think that's sometimes something that I've forgotten about shortcuts, is that it doesn't really make money, and making third-party apps work with this ecosystem is a way that's just like how the App Store ecosystem functions and makes money. So I think that's something that they invest in a little bit more. But I think that's one of the hardest things, is that like you guys and this community get the value of shortcuts, and sometimes it doesn't seem like Apple really invests in that side of it and what it enables a user to do with their technology, like the individual people. And I still think that like that's the reason I'm here doing this still. And I fully would have given up on the tool not working for years and years. I can say, like, with some degree of retrospect, even though we're slightly still in it, like it's been very bad at times, to the point where like certain amounts of this work I haven't done because the tool just didn't even function. I couldn't use Sync for like 3 months at one point, and some of that is just absurd, especially coming from Apple. But then there's this other side of what you can do with it and the control that it gives you over your technology. Like it gives me so much more. I can't imagine using this ecosystem without something like shortcuts. And even something like iPad Pro, I've always been scared of inviting people to use it unless you use shortcuts, because it doesn't make sense for me to buy an iPad for $3,000 that I can't use with automation. And if you're not investing in that, maybe that's why people are having like buyer's remorse for a platform like that, is because the people who have invested deeply in it are using shortcuts or were using workflow back in the days too.
Yeah, agreed. And like I don't know about you, because I make the shortcuts field guides, and weekly I get an email from somebody complaining because I taught some shortcut and they made it on their iPhone, but it doesn't work on the Mac because not all the actions are compatible across different platforms.
Yeah.
And there's all these little gotchas that you can run into if you're not aware of it. And you're right, that's where it becomes a thing where like the power users figure it out and the novice users just throw up their hands and say, well, this isn't for me.
I'd be fascinated if they did like continuity shortcuts, like how you can use widgets from your iPhone apps. If you could run actions from your iPhone apps off your Mac, that would be cool. I think though the Mac version, I'd say it hasn't taken off the way that I thought it might. And I think it's because of the Safari actions that they brought to iPad and iPhone and didn't bring to the Mac. And they're so good on iOS, and they're just not present on the Mac, which is where I think most people use the browser, and some people like almost exclusively use the browser. So some of the most functional actions in shortcuts that could be there aren't, just for that platform. And I'm not exactly sure why. Came out like 3 years ago and just isn't on Mac. And that's like my number one request is please bring the Safari actions to Mac, because then they're universal, and then people can automate their websites, pull up websites, all their tabs and everything, save them, open them up later. Like it's all so useful, but it's the same. They brought it to mobile right when Mac came out. And I feel like that was one where like I can't do everything that I want to. And so I always I've like sort of waited and just sort of been stalled in that area. And I really do think that would alone be a game changer for shortcuts for Mac.
This episode of the Mac Power Users is brought to you by Indeed. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide using Indeed to hire great talent fast. Just go to Indeed.com/MPU. We're all driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. So ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers agree Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites, according to a recent Indeed survey. Hiring the right person is difficult and time-consuming. How do you make sure you get the right person? How many people do you have to see before you can find that right person? Well, Indeed is this massive, powerful filtering system that only gets you the best candidates and it gets them to you right away. Leveraging over 140 million qualifications and preferences every day, Indeed's matching engine is constantly learning from your preferences, so the more you use Indeed, the better it gets. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. And listeners of the Mac Power users will get a $75 sponsored credit to get your job more visibility at Indeed.com/MPU. So just go to INDEED.com/MPU right now and support the Mac Power users by telling them you heard about it here. Indeed.com/MPU is that URL one last time. Terms and conditions apply. Do you need to hire? You need Indeed. And our thanks to Indeed for their support of the Mac Power users and all of Relay FM.
Yeah, shortcuts on the Mac is such an interesting story, right? This app started life on the iPhone. Apple buys it. And when it came to the Mac, it came to a platform that already had a lot of other options, from like shell scripting and AppleScript up through Automator, which came out in Tiger, so a long time ago. We have shortcuts here now, a sort of a layer above it. Shortcuts can reach down, right? It can bring things in from Automator. It can run AppleScript inside a shortcut, which if you had asked me to bet money if that was going to be a thing they did, I would have bet against it, but I'm glad it's there. And so it's fundamentally different, right? On the iPhone and iPad, shortcuts is basically the only way to do a lot of types of automation. But on the Mac, it is in this ecosystem of other things. And that's not even touching third-party tools like Keyboard Maestro and others, Better Touch Tool, other tools that we use and love around here. And so, Matt, I'm curious how you approach that. When you think about the Mac, you think about it being shortcuts being a sibling or a nephew or a niece or something to these other technologies. For someone looking at that, it's really messy. Like, how do you approach it? And do you think that Apple is going to be moving in a direction where shortcuts takes over more and more and these other things fade away? Because so far, I don't think they have. Automator and AppleScript seem just as useful today as they always have.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think one of the most interesting things is I didn't know this until I think even after maybe Workflow was acquired, that if you open Automator and you create a thing, it's called a workflow. And so Workflow literally was Automator for iOS, but just not in name and not by the same team. But so I think that did blow my mind after the fact, that it was like, oh, it straight up was. And that's why it makes sense when they brought it to Mac. They essentially brought all of the functions from Automator, except for like maybe 3 or something like that, into shortcuts as new actions for shortcuts as well. So, and you can even drop .automator files into shortcuts and they will convert to shortcuts. So they put a lot of effort into that one in particular because they knew that they would essentially leave behind users who completely relied on that if they killed Automator entirely. So I think that's an interesting thing. Is it has almost been, I can't remember if it's 3 or 4 years, but I feel like once it hits 5 years past shortcuts for Mac, something like Automator might actually go away. And I think in theory, like, what's the point of saying it? Like, that's the only logical conclusion to saying that it's a feature of automation on the Mac, is it actually replacing that tool. And then also maybe they'll add something new to it for the first time. And they've done a couple actions in the last 5 years, but not to the degree that you would sort of expect if they were turning this into a brand new platform.
Right.
And I think the same thing. It's because of AppleScript and because a lot of developer or like other people rely on shell and things like that, that it's like there is this huge ecosystem that especially AppleScript was like key to even Apple making it through with like the publishing industry and things like that. So some of that is, don't mess with something that's already working, while also put in this new tool to help people who were using iPad can bring it all over and have that same experience. I'd say, at least for me, shortcuts is the front end for all of these other tools. Like, you can run Apple scripts, you can run shell scripts, you can call better touch tool commands and keyboard maestro commands. So at least in terms of a literal thing for just functionally how I use my Mac, as explained before, is if I have a keyboard maestro workflow, I don't remember what it's called right now. I would put that on my Stream Deck by running it via a shortcut. So it's essentially like just that front end and that same experience, or you can put it in the menu bar and bring all these other automation tools into one UI and match what you do across platforms is one way to do it. Also, I mean, yeah, then Shortcuts also has its own backend tools that you can also use. So at least for me, it sort of sits on top of all these other tools and kind of feeds into them. But I'd say the shell stuff and AppleScript stuff are some of my favorite parts about Shortcuts coming to the Mac, because as an iPad user, I can't do any of that stuff. And so suddenly I have all this control. My favorite one by far is pressing keyboard shortcuts using AppleScript, because there's all these other commands in my Mac apps that aren't available in shortcuts, but I can tell it to open and then press Control Shift Option V, and then I guess that's probably paste and match style. That's a great one of like, I don't remember what that keyboard shortcut is. And across 30 different apps, I don't know all of the keyboard shortcuts, but I can program them as shortcuts and put them on my Stream Deck. And then the second I open it, I have all these buttons that represent those keyboard shortcuts available, and I can just tap it and it'll execute it on the computer. I still love that one. And I feel like this is like, I feel like it almost seems like not interesting to other people, but I'm like, yeah, like I can press keyboard shortcuts.
Well, no, I mean, it's the get out of jail free card, right? Because
totally
anything that you can't automate, or like the app developer doesn't have it, you are essentially UI editing or automating by pressing a keyboard shortcut, and you can embed an AppleScript in shortcuts. And I mean, when they announced shortcuts for the Mac and they said, yeah, we're going to have an AppleScript action, that's when I'm like, okay, so this'll, no matter what, this will be good, because you can there's so many different AppleScripts you can write and put together.
I love it. This is like meta Mac work, but Run Script over Shell on iPhone and iPad can run commands remotely on your Mac. And that one has been there since like day one of workflow, and has like, you can remotely control your Mac using your iPhone. And I feel like that alone is this crazy story. And I'm like, oh yeah, you've been able to do it for like 15 years, like, and nobody does it. And it's just like, that's a good example of what bums me out about the Mac so much, is that I wasn't a Mac power user and I was a iPad power user for so long, that now that I'm like the dog that caught the school bus and I don't know what to do with it. Like, I don't know how to use Shell. I don't know how to use AppleScript, and I want to more. And I have all of the desire to, but none of the like domain expertise or use cases that other people already have. And it's because I like built my whole world around this like universal iPad iPhone experience. But now like there's so much untapped on the Mac still that I want to hear from your listeners. I'd love to know what you guys want to do of like that. I think still has like the Mac shortcuts power user community, I feel like is still in its infancy in terms of how much potential there is, because the same thing, there's so much less shackles. And so when you can do anything and you can automate it, I think this is why they haven't added automations on the Mac, is because there's a lot of potential for blowing your computer up and ruining, like running 10,000 shell scripts every night if you don't know what's happening and stuff like that. So I think that's also the weirdest part for people coming from iPhone and iPad, is they probably get a lot of value out of automations, and it's just not even there on the Mac. So like that's another big missing area.
I got a tip for you.
Oh yeah,
get yourself a ChatGPT account.
Oh yeah, I have one.
And then go in there and say, give me an AppleScript that can do X.
I do that for regular expressions, at least, for sure.
Me too. One of the two things I use for most often is regular expressions and AppleScript, because you said I don't have expertise in AppleScript. Well, And granted, it's ChatGPT, and sometimes it gets it wrong a few times. But honestly, you can go back and say, well, I ran it and it gave me this error, and then it'll rewrite it for you. And I know just enough about AppleScript to be dangerous. I've read Sal Segoyan's books. I've programmed them over the years, but I don't do it every day. And it is something you almost need to do every day to be good at. But with my pitiful knowledge plus a ChatGPT account, you'll be shocked. Like I wrote an AppleScript. I just did this in the Max Sparking Labs. One of the listeners wrote in and wanted to get OmniFocus tasks over to a Markdown list because we did that show on NotePlan and people are doing things. So I wrote an AppleScript and it took me 2 attempts in ChatGPT to get it to work exactly the way I wanted. But I could have then pasted that into a shortcut action, and I could have added create new NotePlan note, drop. I could have really made a powerful automation using that AppleScript. So I would tell you, if you're a little uncomfortable with AppleScript, this is something where AI can really help you kind of level up for your shortcuts automations.
I have a ChatGPT thing I created an AppleScript where this is actually, I haven't shared this yet and I want to, because you can use there's a shortcuts command line tool, first of all, just in general. That's awesome that you can run shortcuts from the command line. So if you're on the command line, you can even do more with that. But you can also use the tool to sign shortcuts, which is something that Federico created a tool that I'm trying to even remember how we use it now, but it's a way to basically manually create a shortcut from a plist file and then sign it and turn it into an actual shortcut file. And so I use that. I have a massive one that scrapes my other shortcuts, looks into them, and then if it takes a folder and turns it into one shortcut that's in choose from menu instead. So it's like this whole functional level of shortcuts that you can get into that's not even possible on iOS, which is very cool. But then also you can sort your folders using that command line tool. And so I use ChatGPT because at WWDC I met Ari, and I met up with Ari, and he mentioned that I was always talking about how my folders got out of order because of sync. And he was like, wait, there's a command line tool for that. And I just had never used it. And I used ChatGPT to help me program the right version of it. And now I can use it where I can take, I essentially have a mind map of all of my folders. And if everything gets out of sync, it'll move the folders back into the correct order. And it literally takes the whole list and sorts them one by one and physically moves the folders. But it just, because it's using AppleScript, it can do that kind of automation. It's awesome. I'll have to share both of those, and I can send them to your users, because I feel like people would actually use those ones.
Yeah, absolutely. Please do. And we'll put links in the show notes. But yeah, I think that, kind of the theme of this segment is, you can absolutely do cool stuff with shortcuts on your Mac.
Let me say a couple things before, just because I want to make sure I cover them. Is that have you ever used the services ones, or I guess they're not the quick actions on the Mac? Because I feel like the most unknown feature is that if you are selecting a file and you run a shortcut from the services menu, if you use the stop and output action, it can actually replace the file in place in Finder. And so you can take an image and make it twice as, or reduce the size or something like that, and actually replace the file in place in Finder. And that's a very powerful shortcuts function that it's the same thing of I feel like nobody knows about it and nobody's using it in the way that it was designed for. That's very functional. So explore that if you guys haven't seen it.
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, there's just a lot of options on the Mac that I don't think people are seeing because of the ability to kind of run everything. Then there's this other thing, we don't even need to get into it today, but there's this cross-pollination of automation apps where, Keyboard Maestro can run shortcuts and Alfred can use shortcuts as a trigger, and shortcuts can run a Keyboard Maestro and shortcuts can run, everything talks to each other in a way that we don't get on iOS.
That Alfred one is what I use probably half the time to run my shortcuts. Yeah. It's just type in the name and then just run it.
It's really good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I use the one by Stephen Millard. I know there's a couple different ones, but yeah, you can edit them, you can run them. And it's like I'm in the midst of recording a new Shortcuts field guide, since it's been 6 years, it's time for a new one. But my editor was saying, well, how come you always hit the play button in the videos? I'm like, because I never run these things from the Shortcuts app. I always run them, just from Alfred. But yeah, there's this cross-pollination. I feel like it's almost like a golden era for automation on the Mac for people who want to buy into it. But there definitely is a learning curve to it.
I think it's like one of those things where we have another toolbox, and now we have a garage full of toolboxes, and as much options as you have, sometimes there's just that paradox of choice.
Yeah, too many tools.
Least, yeah. So I try to just start with Shortcuts, and then for me, it's usually, it is like, what's the job to be done? And then I at least have mapped my brain that I can probably do something through Shortcuts. And then on the Mac, if it can't do it, then these other automation tools probably can. So almost like the Phil Schiller theory of automation on the Mac is like, use the easiest tool to get it done first, and then go up to the more complex ones, and maybe use ChatGPT along the way. I don't think he did proof of that, but
no, I don't think he'd like that. Yeah, but the point you make though is that Shortcuts is not the most basic thing. When it first started, because it had a rough beginning, a lot of us were hesitant to use it for, like, I'll say, quote unquote, serious automation. But I had a labs member challenge me because I wrote all these automations to set up contexts using a Keyboard Maestro. He says, well, I don't want to buy Keyboard Maestro. Can I do that with Shortcuts? So I made a bunch of setup shortcuts where, it says, open this app, put it on this spot, open that app, put it on that spot, and turn on the focus mode. And honestly, it was maybe easier and more stable out of Shortcuts than it was out of Keyboard Maestro at the end of the day. I'm super tempted to just move all of my setup scripts into Shortcuts because it is the easier tool. And in some ways, it's just there. It's built into the operating system.
Some of those aren't exactly known for their UI design.
Yeah.
And I think that's why, like, Shortcuts can work with it, though, is if that has the function, then you can kind of just use a shortcut to call it once you built it there. I totally think that's why, in general, Shortcuts has always been accessible to me, because it's Shortcuts and not something that's like Automator. Even Automator is still too obtuse for me to use, but I can make Shortcuts. So I think that's just the accessibility of it, I think, goes a long way. But then it's the same thing of, you can go beyond when these tools make it possible. I definitely do that to Jason Snell when he posts an Apple script. I'm like, why didn't you make this a shortcut? And he's like, oh yeah, good point.
Well, I think we definitely could say that Shortcuts, there's still some dragons, but it's also really doing well in the sense of it's on all platforms, and Apple seems to be continuing to put effort into it, which I think is super important.
Especially, I'd say, the Mac one, I'm glad that the story is more that no one's talking about as much, rather than it's like the iPad and iPhone ones where we're complaining a lot more about how it's actually functioning. In the very early days of Shortcuts for Mac, I think were pretty rough because it was like the first Swift UI Apple app. And so I think it was, and in general, I think a lot of the issues are because it's a Apple app, it's using other platform technologies that then change. And so that's tends to be some of the issues with it. But I think on the Mac, it's still just kind of stable and been there. And really what it needs is more injection of functions from third-party developers. And then I think just in general, scripting stuff can go further than what they did and what we did 7 years ago at Workflow. Like, just even a switch statement kind of thing isn't possible right now. And that's kind of a low-hanging fruit that I think people who are on the Mac want more advanced functions, and they kind of, I think a lot of people will hit the ceiling of that. And if you're a developer, I'd say you'd quickly hit the ceiling. I think power users, it's kind of like more like there's these other rooms of these other apps that you can use as well too.
Yeah, the other thing I can say with a little bit of inside knowledge from largely public postings of job transfers is that after the Mac launch, Apple moved a bunch of folks, old timers that worked on AppleScript and Automator in the past, into the Shortcuts team. And I think originally the Shortcuts team was very heavy on iOS knowledge and light on Mac knowledge. And now there are people on the team that are very knowledgeable about the Mac and automation tools. So they've got some of their real, superstars working on the Mac too. And that's the reason why suddenly everything just started working, I think.
Yeah. I'd say in general, like, they are very responsive to feedback. I think it's always on Apple's timeline. So I think that's the hard part, is you can't necessarily expect it to be fixed in the next beta or like the next release, but there's many features now that are in there because the Shortcuts community has asked for it specifically. And so I'd say on the Mac, if you have feedback and you file it in a way that is, I mean, there's like a standard way to do feedback too that Mac users probably even know more than the iOS world. Is like, if you give them the right use cases and say, here's what should have happened and what does happen, like they're responsive to that. And if you give qualified feedback, they very much appreciate that, because there's a lot of it's broken.
Yeah. I know you're very passionate about web apps and Shortcuts, which is something I think a lot of people don't even know exists or didn't even know was possible. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I have been, the whole ability to add Mac or Safari windows to the dock, it actually was born out of Shortcuts in many ways, which itself came from iOS, which then reverse came from Safari. But I'll just start from the beginning. Is on iOS, you could add apps to the home screen, and then you're able to do the same thing with Shortcuts, essentially calling a web wrapper for that shortcut. On the Mac, before it ever came to Safari, they added the ability to add shortcuts to the dock, which is another like unknown function that most people might not know. You can essentially turn it into like a little app and just click it there. And then I think they took that same technology the next year, and for websites, you can create a mini web app similar. Was it Flutter that used to do this?
There's a bunch of them. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like when an app doesn't have a Mac app, you can essentially create a shell for it and it just calls up the website. But what tends to happen is I made one for YouTube, and then I open all my YouTube links in Safari, and then it has the giant banner that says, do you want to open this in the YouTube app? And then I just have to always jump through this hoop to go from the app to Safari, then back to the web app. And so I realized at some point, I was like, this sounds like something that Shortcuts can do. And it's using Apple script, as you just tell it to open the URL in that web app, and you can take any, like if you receive a YouTube video, you can run this shortcut and immediately open it in YouTube for Mac then. And so I essentially realized, because I want to have that same experience everywhere, I could take everything that was on my 15 pages of iPhone and iPad home screens and bring them to the Mac as different dock icons. So like I have Stripe and then the Apple support webpage or the Apple Store as web apps on my Mac. And then I can use Shortcuts to take any external URLs and open them directly into that. So what I did was, rather than having all these standalone functions that I just have to constantly take URLs and pass them through this kind of like opener, instead I just have a universal thing built now into a lot of my shortcuts, where at the last step, instead of just opening the URL, it'll call the Apple script. When it's on the Mac, it'll call the Apple script and then open it in the web app. So I essentially have cross-platform actions that can open stuff either in the iOS apps or the Mac web apps as a universal shortcut. So that same example of, rather than trying to pass everything through Safari and one app on the web that I also don't have actions for on the Mac, I instead send them out into individual apps and can kind of, I find it great because I like to command tab between my different apps rather than inside Safari. So I am a Mac app user rather than just like a browser person. But now I have essentially mini browsers all over the place. And then this is why, if anyone has also seen it, I have the worst possible dock ever known to man, because I tried to put, for each of those home screens, at least usually I have like 8 apps per home screen. So I put all of those into my dock. And so it just fills the entire bottom bar at the smallest size possible. But I have like Hulu in there and Amazon Prime Video and Regal Cinemas and stuff. It's totally not necessary, but I just did it because I like it.
One of the things you glanced over earlier in the show that I know we're going to get email about if we don't address, you said people don't realize what you can do with AirPods and HomePod and shortcuts. Matt, what can we do with AirPods and HomePod with shortcuts? What are you doing with it?
I think the most confusing thing in the transition from what was Siri shortcuts to just all being in the Shortcuts app is that the name of the shortcut is actually the trigger phrase. And so as long as you have an action that can run from your AirPods or HomePod that essentially doesn't show any custom UI, you can run it just by asking Siri to say the name, and you just say the name to Siri and she'll run the shortcut. And what's really unique is actions like ask for input, choose from list, and choose from menu. All of the prompts that you include in those actions, she'll read out loud to you, and then she'll read the list of options that you can pick from as well. And so I've very much designed my shortcuts for years to operate this way, where the title of the shortcut is a natural phrase that you would say to Siri. And then each of the prompts are essentially Siri asking you to answer the questions. And then you have like natural language in those so that it's like, which ones do you want to choose? And then she lists out 4 and I say the third one. And then it takes that and passes it into the next step. And so as long as it doesn't use a custom interface from an app or open into the app, it works headlessly is what I'll call it, from AirPods or HomePod. And it's actually the way that I've found the most powerful use just in general with shortcuts is the get contents of URL action lets you send requests to websites. And so I use Airtable to manage a lot of my data. And so I can use something like I can just say to my HomePod, like, send this to Airtable, and then it'll say, what's the title of the entry? And I say it out loud, and then it's like, great, I just sent it, and it can send that web request out in the background and up to the web, which actually HomePod can even do from HomeKit as well, which is the other powerful home automation function. Same thing, as long as it doesn't show an interface, then you can run it from HomeKit automations too. So that's 2 answers in one.
You could see how that could really evolve if this HomePod plus screen thing ever shows up, which Gurman keeps calling a robot in his reporting, which is like, it's not a robot, dude. But I could see this pushing further, right? That your shortcuts are in between your devices. They also kind of become part of the ambient computing that we already have to a degree with the HomePod and AirPods. But I think that could go further and really unlock some interesting things in the home if that product ever surfaces.
I'm assuming it's controls. That's what I noticed because controls and widgets are all powered by app intents. So it's essentially a shortcut. And so I noticed that all of the control center stuff could easily work on a HomePod screen, including you can put shortcuts in Control Center this year. So I think that's another cool function is you could have a shortcut there and it could just show different menus and you could run it. I feel like I'm curious if people would want that sounds like something that Apple might not let you do for some reason. And I'm preemptively going to file feedback about it or something. But say if there was a screen, just because I think the one platform that doesn't have shortcuts right now is Apple TV when you're using it. You can actually control the Apple TV using the Apple TV remote actions, but you can't do things like run a shortcut from the TV. And so in general, it's the problem with home automations and shortcuts is that shortcuts use your apps and home automations and home platforms don't, and they don't have access to your apps. So they can't run something from Ivory because it doesn't have Ivory. The HomePod doesn't. And so I think there is this split in between shortcuts and home automations that might create issues with that HomePod robot that there's a little bit of like church and state there that I think that's, again, though, a limitation that maybe in the long run with Apple Intelligence, App Intense, if they can really do a lot more, like they don't need to show the app. So maybe it could run, I don't know, or like universal control, like I was saying with it could run iPhone and shortcuts if you could do something like that from the HomePod. I think that'd all be great. I think that's why the AirPods and HomePod thing, it's really like Apple is almost, they mention it in WWDC videos and they don't really emphasize the experience for users. I think because it's just kind of, it is a little obtuse. Like to build a shortcut and then run it totally from voice and evaluate whether it was correct and change it is hard. And that's like one of the weirdest things for me coming from workflow and now being like the face of or not, I don't know, that's an awful way to say it, but just like fully embedded in something like Siri shortcuts, is that the actual Siri experience is something that I use the least because I just have too many. And I think my whole existential issue is something that they need to figure out in the long run. Is like, what does it look like for someone to buy into this platform and use it for everything? And right now, you're going to have a bad time. Like there's just a single file list of folders. Like give me some like very basic quality of life things would go a long way. And something like being able to bring up your Siri commands when you're using your, like what Siri commands can I use here? All those kind of things that they kind of took away. Some of those affordances for voice, I think, could go further. Even just explaining to people that the name of the shortcut is the Siri trigger phrase is, I think, something that is like totally lost on most people. They've actually, now that I think about it, they've given some UI affordances where they like tell you to say the name, but still, I don't see people doing that often. So there's room to grow.
Certainly not often enough, but that's why we have things like MatthewCassinelli.com so they can go learn, right?
It is giving me a job.
There you go.
They're not doing it. So
cool. Matthew, thank you so much for coming in today and sharing kind of an update on shortcuts and your journey with us. I love that you started out listening to MPU. I had no idea when we booked it, and we've known each other all these years. But yeah, it's awesome. And shortcuts is something that I think everybody should be looking into. And even just making those little 2 and 3 action shortcuts can still make your life a lot easier, gang. Just take some time and learn it. Matthew, where should people go if they want to learn more?
MatthewCassinelli.com is the main spot. You can find my newsletter and membership there and all my blog posts. And I link out to my videos and when I do podcasts like this. But then I'm on Mastodon and Threads as well. And you can just find me through my name there.
We are the Mac Power Users. You can find us at relay.fm/MPU. You can sign up there for more power users. Today, we're going to be talking to Matt about Apple Intelligence and AI. Thank you to our sponsors, 1Password, NetSuite, and Indeed. And we'll see you next time.